Unfortunately, I didn't have a great way to record myself forging and finishing the blade, so I took lots of progress pictures that I'm going to show while discussing my process. Then at the end, I've got a video of the blade in action. My design for the blade takes most of its inspiration from the pirate cutlass. I took that idea down to a large knife size and added a spiked D-guard and pommel blade for a little extra apocalyptic flair. I worked out the dimensions for my blade, handle, and pommel blade, as well as how much of my original stock would need to be devoted to each to get the desired result. I forgot to take a picture before sticking it in the fire, but I started out with a piece of 12 inch by 1.5 inch by 3/16 inch 1095. If you look closely about 3.5 inches from the top, you can see the marks for where I need to fuller and isolate my tang. I also have the Hardy and top fuller ready to go. The tang and pommel blade sections have been successfully isolated and drawn out to the proper size. With a good heat in that 4-pound hammer, the 1095 was moving beautifully. In order to get the blade to the size and shape that I wanted, I needed to bring the width down to roughly 1 inch, without adding too much thickness to the material. Once that was done, I rough forged in the tip. Here we can see the final overall blade shape. It's tough to tell from my photos, but I've also forged in the bevels. I left a bit of a rough tip, but that will get taken care of in the grind a little bit later. Thanks to the 4-pound hammer moving steel like a champ, I was able to move on to the guard during the same forging session. Unfortunately, I didn't have any mild steel, so I decided to make the guard out of a piece of 1075 that I had laying around. I marked my fuller locations and got to it. The mark at the very top is where I was planning to do my decorative curls, but that later got cut from the design. After fullering and drawing out the top and bottom sections, I used the peen to spread the middle section into a wider guard. This will afford a bit more protection for the hand, as well as giving me material to cut the spikes. I intentionally left most of the forge marks in place to give it a more authentic feel, and even added a bit of texture with a ball peen hammer. The first forge day was a massive success. I live in an apartment and don't have a personal forge setup, so making this much progress was incredibly helpful. I did a bit of cleanup to the blade profile at home, and then went out to the forge another night and did the heat treating. Everything went smoothly and it hardened without warping on the first attempt. Now that the blade has been hardened, it's time to do some grinding. I have a small 1 inch by 42 inch Rikon belt grinder on my patio, so I got the blade profile roughly ground in before starting on the rest of the finishing work. I'm a bit frustrated that I somehow managed to forget to take pictures of it, but I made a very rough punch out of some mid-carbon mystery steel I had, roughly the size of the bottom of the tang. I used that to punch and drift the starting holes for the tang in my guard. I also attempted to do some hot fitting to the tang. However, I didn't have enough time out at the shop to make that happen, so jeweler's files it is. It took quite a bit of time at my makeshift workbench, but finally both the top and bottom were filed to size. The next step was getting my guard spikes done. I drilled guide holes that I had a plan, and so my hacksawing didn't have to be as precise. I got all the teeth cut out and it's looking pretty gnarly. Finally, I got the jeweler's files back out and took the jagged edges off, as well as honed the points a bit. I have no plans to heat treat or properly sharpen these spikes, but I wanted them to be mean anyways. Back out at the forge, I got the teeth bent outward over the edge of the anvil, and then shaped the guard using the horn and some hot fitting. Once I'd tested the fit and brushed off the scale, I finished the guard with some boiled linseed oil to protect it from the zombie gore and give it a nice dark look. The final forge step was to put the minor bend in the pommel blade and make sure it all still fit together nicely. After a bit more grinding on the blade and the pommel blade, and having a properly fitted guard, it's time to start working on the handle. Back at the balcony workshop, I started out with a big hunk of Texas Ebony. I cut the length down to what I needed so I could get started properly on the handle. Due to the design of the blade, mostly the curved pommel blade aspect, I needed to do a 2-piece handle construction, so I split my wood in half, smoothed out the rough sides a bit, and got to the arduous task of trying to get a tight fit inside of the guard. Luckily, a friend who does a lot of woodworking warned me that Texas Ebony is a very hard wood and recommended I pick up a rasp. This ultimately saved me because my belt grinder was not making very fast progress. It took quite a bit of elbow grease, but eventually both sides fit. This is only the second knife I've ever made, and I'd never done a handle construction like this before, so I decided to take a Dremel and carve grooves in the area the tang would need to be. I then did a rough chisel of the area and cleaned it up with a regular file and those jeweler's files again. I really wish I had drilled my pinholes at this point since the handles are still squared up, but I didn't think about it. More on that later. I did some rough shaping to each piece individually, and then had to come up with some odd clamping solutions so I could make those shapes line up. After many hours and tons of wood shavings, the rough shaping was finally complete. Next came the pinning. Originally I was going to use stainless pins, but the stock that I had was a bit too wide, and I was worried I would damage the integrity of the tang, so I went with 3/16 inch brass instead. The fact that my handle was already shaped made drilling the pinholes exceptionally difficult and nerve-wracking, made worse by the fact that I don't have a drill press. I managed to rig up a little jig with some wood scraps to help me keep my drill bit perpendicular to the tang when I drilled that. Then I used the holes in the tang as a guide to drill one scale. And finally, I put all three pieces together and drilled down through the already drilled scale and tang to put a hole in the final scale. It was an amazing sense of relief when all three pins went in smoothly. Then it was time for the 24-hour epoxy and some clamps. As a side note, that bottom spike is cracked due to the fact that I attempted to bend the spikes with a map torch and some vice grips. Once I screwed up one spike, I waited until I could get back to the forge to bend the rest. After the epoxy set, I filed down the excess pins, did a bit more rasping, and then finished it off with 4 stages of sandpaper from 60 to 220 grit. There wasn't much to see, so I didn't take any pictures. However, after the handle was cleaned up, I used sandpaper, a long square block of wood, and a piece of tile to give both blades their final sharpening. The steel definitely hardened nicely because that took a lot longer than I expected it to. The final step for finishing my blade was oiling the handle with boiled linseed oil. I'm a big fan of linseed oil for the utilitarian look and feel that it provides, and I think that fits right in with this blade. And now, without further ado, let's see the whole piece finished. Remember these two jack-o'-lanterns from the beginning of the video? They were carved to make our Texas Ren Fair campsite more festive, but also to be our zombie stand-ins. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's test the blade out. I really couldn't be happier with how the blade performed. The edge geometry I was aiming for was fairly stout, since it needs to be able to take out a zombie head. Even so, it sliced right through the pumpkins with no issues whatsoever. The D-guard worked great for punching, and the pommel blade, while a bit impractical to use, was still fun to have.